My name's not important, but I'll tell you I was an ER nurse for 6 years before I switched departments. This happened during my 3rd year, at a hospital I'm not going to name, on a floor that doesn't exist anymore, not because anything happened to it, they just renovated it into something else a while back. But that's not really the point. Night shifts in the ER are their own kind of strange. Everything moves slower and faster at the same time. Slower because the hallways are dead quiet at 3 a.m., and faster because the second something goes wrong, it goes wrong hard. I'd gotten used to the rhythm of it. I liked the night shift, actually. Less chaos, more control. This particular night was quiet. Too quiet, if I'm honest, but I didn't think much of it at the time. We had one patient in bed 4, an elderly man who'd come in for chest pains, stable, resting, nothing urgent. I did my rounds every hour like normal. Checked his vitals at 1 a.m., everything fine. Checked again at 2, same thing. It was on my 3 a.m. round that things got strange. I walked in and the curtain around his bed was pulled shut. That wasn't unusual on its own. Patients pull their own curtains sometimes if they want privacy or if a light's bothering them. What was unusual was that I hadn't pulled it, and no one else was on that side of the floor. I remember standing there for a second before pulling it back. He was asleep, or at least he looked asleep. But his monitor was reading wrong. Heart rate steady, blood oxygen steady, but the numbers weren't updating. They were frozen. I checked the machine, tapped the screen, even unplugged and replugged the sensor. Nothing changed. The exact same numbers, down to the decimal, for what I'd guess was at least 20 minutes based on the timestamp log. That's when I noticed the smell. Faint, but there. Not a hospital smell. Something closer to wet soil, like a basement after rain. I looked around for a source and found none. The vents were running normal air. Nothing had spilled. I chalked it up to exhaustion and moved on to reset the machine from the nurse's station. At 3:40, a different nurse came to relieve me for a break, and she asked me why bed 4's chart said he'd been marked deceased at 2:15. I hadn't marked anything. No one had called a code. The man was breathing when I left him 10 minutes earlier. We ran back to the room together, and he was sitting up in bed, wide awake, calmly asking us why we looked so pale. He told us he'd had the strangest dream. He said he dreamed someone had been standing at the foot of his bed for a long time, just watching him, and that it felt less like a dream and more like a memory that hadn't happened yet. He was discharged 2 days later, completely healthy. I looked into the chart entry for weeks after. It was never explained. No one ever fixed the log, they just deleted the erroneous timestamp and moved on, because what else do you do with something like that? I don't work nights anymore. This one isn't mine, it was told to me by a friend who worked as an orderly, but I believed every word of it, and after what I've seen in hospitals myself, I don't doubt it for a second. Room 214 had a reputation before he even started working there. Nobody said it outright, but there was a pattern the older staff all seemed to know and never talked about directly. Patients placed in that room, regardless of what they were being treated for, tended to decline faster than expected. Nothing anyone could point to medically. Just a pattern. My friend didn't believe in that kind of thing. He'd worked in hospitals for years and had seen enough real death to know it doesn't need help from anything supernatural. So when he got assigned to work an overnight shift that happened to include room 214, he didn't think twice. The patient in there was a woman in her 70s, recovering from a hip surgery, stable and lucid. Around 1 a.m., she asked him to please not turn the lights all the way off, which was a common enough request. He left a small night light on and continued his rounds. At around 2:30, her call button went off. When he got there, she was sitting bolt upright, staring at the corner of the room near the closet, and she asked him in a very calm voice if he could see the woman standing there too. There was no one there. He checked the closet, checked the bathroom, checked under the bed like an idiot because it felt like the thing to do. Nothing. He told her it was probably a trick of the shadows from the nightlight, and she nodded, but she kept looking at that corner even after he left. He said the thing that got him wasn't that moment. It was what happened when he checked the room's old patient log out of curiosity the next day. Over the past 2 years, 4 separate patients in that exact room had reported seeing a woman standing in that same corner, always around the same time, always described the same way. Long dark hair, standing very still, never doing anything except watching. None of those 4 patients survived their stay. The patient with the hip surgery did survive, and was discharged a week later. My friend asked her once, gently, if she remembered saying anything about the corner of the room. She said she didn't remember any of that night at all, and actually seemed a little frightened that he'd asked. He requested to never be assigned that room again, and management didn't ask why. He said that alone told him everything he needed to know. I used to work as a resident, and this happened during one of my rotations, long enough ago now that the hospital has since closed that wing entirely. I still don't have an explanation for it, and honestly, the not knowing is worse than if it had just been something normal and scary. Residents get pulled onto strange consults sometimes, and this one seemed routine enough. A patient in the ICU, non-responsive, family requesting a second opinion on brain activity before making a difficult decision. I was there mostly to observe and take notes for the attending physician. The scans came back with activity that made no clinical sense. Not flatline, not standard unconscious patterns, but something the attending said he'd never personally seen in 15 years of practice. Localized spikes, extremely brief, in a pattern that looked almost rhythmic. Like a code. He didn't say the word code out loud. I did, as a joke, and nobody laughed. We ran the scan 3 separate times over 2 days to rule out equipment error. Same results every time. The spikes occurred at almost exactly the same intervals down to the second, which is not something a human brain does under any known condition, responsive or not. On the second night, I was reviewing the readouts alone in the equipment room when the machine started printing again on its own. It wasn't scheduled to. No one had triggered a scan. I checked the machine's logs afterward, and there was no record of it starting itself. It simply produced a new readout, unprompted, identical in pattern to the earlier ones. I brought it straight to the attending, who looked at it for a long time without saying anything, then told me to log it as equipment malfunction and never brought it up again. The patient passed away 4 days later, of causes entirely consistent with his prior condition, nothing suspicious about the death itself. But I kept that readout. I still have it in a drawer somewhere, and every few years I take it out and look at those spikes again, and I still can't tell you what I think they mean. This story was told to me by a security guard who worked hospital overnight shifts for almost 2 decades, and out of everything I've heard from people in that line of work, this is the one that still bothers him the most. Sometime past midnight, a man walked into the ER lobby and asked to be admitted. He wasn't bleeding, wasn't in obvious distress, just calmly told the front desk he needed a bed for the night because something was, in his words, going to happen to him, and he didn't want to be alone when it did. Staff assumed a mental health concern and processed him accordingly, moved him to a room for observation, standard procedure. He was cooperative the entire time, answered every question clearly, showed no signs of confusion or distress beyond that one statement. Around 3 a.m., the guard did a routine walk past his room and noticed the man sitting upright in complete stillness, staring directly at the door. Not sleeping, not agitated, just watching the door like he was waiting for something to come through it. The guard asked if he was all right, and the man said, without looking away from the door, that it was almost time. Nothing happened for another 20 minutes. The guard admits he almost forgot about the whole thing until the hallway lights flickered, just once, all at once, for the entire wing. Not a power issue, maintenance confirmed later there was no electrical fault logged that night. When he went back to check the room, the man was gone. Not discharged, not transferred, simply not there, and the bed was made as though no one had used it at all. Security footage from that hallway showed the men walking calmly out of frame toward an exit that, according to the building's layout, didn't connect to anywhere outside the building. No one ever located him. No ID on file turned out to be real. The intake form he filled out that night has since gone missing from hospital records, and the guard says he's the only one left who remembers it happening at all. Last one, and this one's mine. I worked in hospital pathology support for a few years, mostly paperwork and prep work, nothing glamorous, and definitely not something that requires nerves of steel most days. Most days. The morgue in most hospitals isn't the dramatic, dimly lit place you see in movies. It's cold, fluorescent, and mostly boring. I want to be clear about that because what happened doesn't fit the boring version of that room at all. I was working a late shift alone, cataloging intake, when I heard what sounded like knocking. Not from a door. From inside one of the storage units. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, then silence. Every unit was accounted for. I checked the log twice. Every body in that room had been there for hours, some for days, all pronounced by 2 separate physicians per protocol. There was no possibility of a mistake, and I want to say clearly I do not believe anyone was alive in that room. I stood there for a long time, telling myself it was pipes, or the building settling, or my own nerves playing tricks after a long shift. Then it happened again. Same 3 knocks, same unit. I did not open it. I want to be honest about that, because in every version of this story I've ever heard, someone opens the door, and I did not. I called another staff member down, and we stood there together for almost half an hour. It didn't happen again while we waited, and neither of us said much of anything. The next morning, a technician doing a routine transfer found that the body in that specific unit had shifted position slightly from how it had been documented at intake. Not fallen, not disturbed by any equipment malfunction, just shifted, like something had moved. There was no explanation offered, none accepted, and the incident was logged simply as unit malfunction, which everyone in that department knew wasn't true, because that unit worked perfectly both before and after that night. I don't work nights in that department anymore either. Some things you just don't go looking for a second time.